Okay, we're going to be doing something a little bit different today, and I'm very, very excited that Cynthia and Mathew Crawford are here with me together as we're going to do a little joint Rising Tide Foundation, Rounding the Earth, uh, sharing of ideas and discoveries, which I mean, Mathew Crawford and us have been friends now for some time, and we've really found that Matthew's ability to carry out a quality of research that very few can do is really stood out. I enjoy, Matthew, reading your regular Substack. Your updates are very, very useful, and I think we're all sort of like moving on a similar trail. So we've been sort of living and breathing, trying to like just piece together what are the deeper, subtle undercurrents, the sets of ideas that have misshapen so much of the 20th century and 21st century that we're going into, and inversely, what are some of the better ideas which oligarchical systems are afraid of? Obviously, that contrast, that counterpoint, is always an important thing to have in mind. And I know you got your finger on the pulse, and you've been looking at some very interesting things touching on theosophy, the deeper occult operations underpinning things that today people typically treat as purely geoeconomic or geostrategic, but it's actually, you can't understand any of that, any of the mechanics, if you don't look at the deeper metaphysical and especially occult proclivities and belief structures that are underlying all of this stuff. So I know you've got a bunch of discoveries or a bunch of insights that you've been making, and little currents, or what do you call it, threads you've been pulling on. And I'm curious to see what have you been looking at these days, Matthew?
Well, I have to say I appreciate the compliment because I was excited to start talking with you guys because you had clearly read so much history, and you guys are prolific in writing about it. But if you want to start off on my latest thoughts, just what we were discussing right before we started, I heard you and Courtney Turner bring up Project Monarch, which is, it's a challenging conversation because unlike MK Ultra, there's not like a trove of documentation that's ever been found on it, and I doubt that there ever will be. In particular, I think that unlike MK Ultra, this is not a U.S. operation, but it is an operation that occurred on U.S. soil, and I think that is kind of the key to MK Ultra. There is a long history of mind control, attempts and programming and things like that. You're very familiar with the Hashashim from 1,000 years ago, the original assassins, as it were, and I think that like myself, you believe that was sucked into European, power societies. That's certainly what I believe, anyhow. But in particular, Project Monarch. So, uh, you know. I, I'm going to share this point. My opinion is that the pandemic really came out of the British Empire Circle. I have a belief in that direction, and it's partially because of things like connections to the wildlife trusts. In fact, EcoHealth Alliance used to be called Wildlife Trust. That's what it spawned from. Everybody refers to it as a U.S. based organization. Peter Daszak's a Brit, right? But
Right.
there's so many threads back there. But so I got a little bit interested in thinking about Monarch after I saw gangs from South America with monarch tattoos, and I thought, I wonder what kind of progress I could make studying Project Monarch, right? Because everybody just always says, well, it's a conspiracy theory because there's no firm evidence about it, and it had occurred to me that all these members of the royal family and those members of the Nazi party that were really various European elites and royals and all that kind of stuff were involved in all of these environmentalist organizations. Really, they created the industry of environmentalist organizations like the World Wildlife Fund, right? But then you've got the wildlife trusts, which encompasses several dozen organizations, really almost all of which spawn from the UK itself. So, the people involved in these organizations seem to have a high overlap with all those people who have been involved in the famous pedophile scandals like Jeffrey Epstein or Jimmy Savile. And there are several others. I'd have to look them up at this moment, but several others who've been involved with the British royal family.
Hmm.
So I did a little bit of research, and and the British royal family has some connection to lepidoptery, the study of butterflies, but the Rothschild family has a bunch. In fact, there were several members of the Rothschild family who were entomologists, and I think it was Charles Rothschild was an entomologist. He was the one who studied the Oriental rat flea, which became blamed for the bubonic plague, for the Black Plague, which that makes me kind of scratch my head, the last hair on my head, and makes me wonder if I should just accept the story on face about the Oriental rat flea being the cause. But in particular, he was an entomologist, and he killed himself. The story is that he had a lot of pressure on himself, but who knows, right? He had two daughters, however, which carried on the study of butterflies, at least to some degree. And one of those was Panonica de Konisforder. She was originally Kathleen something de Rothschild, Baroness Kathleen de Rothschild. And there's a butterfly, a monarch called the Rothschild birdwing. And I can't remember if she named it herself. I think she named it, but I could be wrong about that. But she was also called the Empress of Jazz. And this is interesting because when you go and study, where were these LSD experiments occurring, and, what kinds of entrapment programs were created, the earliest kind of chatter of those sorts of things go all the way back to the beginning of the jazz explosion and like the Cotton Club. And it's known that there was a lot of like drugs and stuff going on. And you also had, several people die young. You've got some suicides in there, but you've got a whole lot of drug abuse, which would be, ways to control people, which is exactly what MK Ultra was set to study, right? So I haven't gone extremely deep into all those connections, but I'll just mention some names of people want to like research, like what, who am I talking about? What's going on? But like, John Coltrane and Miles Davis, and and more than I'm gonna remember in a conversation immediately. Um, but before I got to her, actually, I stumbled upon Miriam Rothschild. Miriam Rothschild was also a daughter of Charles Rothschild. She was real smart, very smart. She she was noted for her study of butterflies. I think she may have been the person who figured out that the special thing about monarchs and a certain category of butterflies is that they have these very long migration patterns. In fact, these are multi-generational migration patterns. They'll go all the way up to Canada, and then they'll go all the way down to Mexico. And literally, you have birth cycles that take place, and they only lay their eggs on the milkweed plant. And so, milkweed is specifically very important to the butterflies. You could destroy the butterflies by destroying milkweed, but what milkweed does for these butterflies is it endows them with the ability to be poisonous to predators, right? A bird who would go and eat, a young butterfly or a caterpillar, crawling on the milkweed plant, would then, suffer an effect from it. So the birds know to stay away, right? They'll pick different prey if they can. Um,
Hmm.
during World War II, Miriam Rothschild went to work at Bletchley Circle, which is, that's the code breaking center of British intelligence. They're the ones who cracked Enigma. That's where uh,
Yeah, the
was it John Nash? Why
no,
am I
not
thinking?
John Nash, not John Nash.
It's
No,
not John Nash, but that
yeah,
name came
yeah,
into my head. But
I know.
um,
Turing.
Turing.
Turing, Alan Turing. Thank you, Alan Turing. That's where Alan Turing and his cadre were, right? But she was specifically tasked with thinking about biowarfare programs, right? And just sort of like modeling of animal behavior in terms of how it is you would attack an enemy. And so just knowing that much about her and knowing that her sister then went to New York and became the Empress of Jazz around all these people, where you had this sudden explosion of a brand new culture that gets billed as the uniquely American art. Right. But you have this brand new culture that involves a lot of drugs and people going crazy, and that there is some notable connection later on to the MK Ultra programs. So
Oh,
I wanted to bring that up because I had heard you and Courtney start to talk about it while I was sort of in the middle of doing my research on that.
I had no idea. I'm shocked because yeah, Courtney brought it up and we chatted about the hypothesis that the name given to that particular species of butterfly monarch um might have some connection to the royal family and the fact that that was selected as the moniker for the actual monarch project itself, as far as monarch mind control is concerned. That was very provocative, but I didn't think that you could probably go further than just loosely hypothesize. So I appreciate all of this bounty of new considerations you've brought to the field. But one thing we didn't do yet is we didn't define what was Project Monarch. For those watching right now who may not know what that is, let's quickly take a step back, Matthew. So could you, in your words, say a little word about what you understand Project Monarch to have been?
I Funny, hearing about it sort of gradually over the years, I never thought of just putting it, there are different forms of mind enslavement, right? There's the Hashashim who were just so convinced that if they just followed the orders of their master, that they would go to heaven, which would just be this place where they could just party it up with, you know, essentially drugs and whores for eternity. Monarch would be a different sort of mind slaving program, but it would be specifically to take control of, I would think, a usually female participant. But it occurs to me that, male gay prostitutes would probably also, fit into this. But the point would be to use them for spycraft or, compromising people in general. And there is a decent history of speculation that young homosexual men were used in spycraft in European warfare, for instance, but possibly larger realms, right? Some of that goes all the way back to Rumi, the poet, who was sort of, he was expected to become an imam, but he kind of took a different path, and he was, I guess, having sexual encounters with a number of princes, around the realm, and he's the guy who came up with like the dance of the whirling dervish and stuff that winds up like flowing into that whole bocce boy culture.
That was
That
Rumi, really.
Oh, yeah, I didn't know that.
Oh,
Yeah, I've done a lot of research on him, going back several years. Actually, I think that he spawned a global trade in children.
Wow.
But that's a long story that I'd want to pull out my notes to even talk about that, because there's a number of like elements of language that wind up in cultures all over the world, like words that seem to originate right around his time period
okay.
that then spanned, and then you even see these words associated with like K-pop, for instance, like and tattoos, that gangs use to mark, prostitutes that work for them.
Mm.
So it's interesting that suddenly in the last 20 years or so, I don't know exactly when it started again. Rumi is suddenly sort of like repopularized, and it happens to be repopularized, I've noticed, in specifically these like spiritual techno circles. Friends of mine that I met in California who were like, in the singularity movement crowd, and in these specific spirituality tech circles, I would see, publishing like Rumi quotes on their Facebook. And that was before I would have even known to research. I don't even know what prompted me to research that. That was like 6 or 7 years ago. But um, all of this sort of encompasses, I guess, you'd asked me to talk some about MK Ultra, and I don't know if we want to hit other subjects first, because it sounded like there were some things that you guys wanted to talk about, that we could go into. We're kind of touching on the tech sector, I think, in some ways, because I do think the tech sector has a huge injection of this sort of spirituality cult type stuff that stems from these traditions.
Mm.
And I bumped up against it in my, and people that I've met over the years. It's part of what made me dig a little bit deeper into some of it and realize that it had connections to the cult that I grew up in. Um,
Mm.
But like, one of the people that I met along the way, Magat Wade, for instance, is like besties with Grimes, Elon Musk's wife.
What?
Oh,
Uh,
Really?
yeah, and her husband had actually offered me a job running the math department at a school that they were building at
whoa.
this like consciousness center in Austin, Texas, years ago. And that turned into a bit of a fiasco because he broke some financial promises along the way, and I got for years I wouldn't deal with him until he was connecting me with people during the pandemic stuff because of my research. And now I look at that and I go, was that to sabotage me or to help me along?
Well,
Hmm.
definitely this consider like this entire field is something we found very fascinating. It's very, I think, underappreciated the role of this controlling the the breakdown, the controlled disintegration of natural human integrated personalities and the reconstruction of personalities with schizophrenic disorders, such that, and I mean, that was one of the goals of MK Ultra, right? Was to figure out how do you compartmentalize a human personality utilizing trauma-based mind control techniques, electroshock, torture, all sorts of things, and all sorts of drugs were developed. All of the drugs that we find in our current culture that have been so normalized all come out of these efforts by the Anglo-American military industrial intelligence complex in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, all of it. And it wasn't like this stuff just came out of a vacuum where all of a sudden after World War II, the thought was, okay, hey, let's use drugs, trauma, torture to break down people and try to reconstruct them in the desired image, like a computer program almost, to do certain things, right? On behalf of those wishing to manage, let's say, assassins that would lose themselves, blank out, and then not know why they have blood on their hands when they wake up. It's not like that came out of a vacuum. When you actually start digging at these more subtle currents of history, you start seeing evidence of this everywhere. You see it within the conventional mafia syndicate systems that Cynthia has written extensively about, and their overlaps with mystery cults that go back way longer than people think. You see it within the assassin, the Kali cults of India, which also involved the followers, which was a huge thing for over like 8 centuries. Probably still is a thing of Kali worshiping uh, murderers who thought that they were doing a sacred act by murdering their victims and stealing from them, and it was a whole cult. It involved drug use as well, hypnotic trances, right? A lot of these techniques that we'd also seen in certain currents within the Sufi tradition. I won't say, I don't want to overly generalize, but we also see that overlapping with agencies that were tying into the Templars, the Albana Sufi order from Egypt that was interfacing with the Templars as the Templars began to excavate Solomon's temple. And they were like, "Oh, you wear the cross, but you don't. We know what the meaning of the cross is." And then they told them the secret esoteric meaning of the cross, and all of this stuff became a bit apocryphal. But you got these things. You got the assassin orders of, as you were alluding to, the Ismailite Nizari Ismailite assassins as well, that are sort of a sub branch of Shia mystics that were also working with the Templars to oversee the Crusades, but that also did drug initiation ceremonies that involved extreme sensual pleasure with extreme pain vacillating in between, along with drugs that involved people breaking down, schisming their personalities, recombining them to become little assassins that would go into a trance and carry out a hit or a terrorist activity back in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. So we've seen this all over the place, and it just seems like they've honed it more in a centralized way in the form of what came out of World War II, but it was already there. It was just more honed. So the fact that Project Monarch came out of this thing, like Kathy O'Brien described this in quite some detail, and you've had personal experiences within cult settings tied to the military in your own personal experience growing up as a child. So this is all super fascinating and extremely important stuff. And I think that, yeah, just getting people don't know that you can even talk about this. It's usually just treated so shadowy and esoterically that the conversations that I tend to hear about it are very messy online. So I appreciate
Right, right.
all that.
They are messy, and of course we have that thought terminating cliche conspiracy theory thrown at it so that people won't, go and do enough research to put it together in a non-messy way, right? Yeah, you're told to stay away from this topic, right? But it kind of makes sense that warfare or civilization control moved in this direction. When you go back 2,000 years, when you're talking about these, empire armies, these forces are built on the idea of a sword to every man's back,
Right.
right? To the extent that you had improperly put together militaries, you would have desertions. And these desertions would completely ruin a battle plan, for instance, right? So, what do you need to do in order to create a force where you don't need a hierarchy of swords to backs in order to march, 10,000 or 50,000 or 200,000 men into battle? That sort of answers the question how somebody might have stumbled upon that and then started using it more and more, and then of course it would spread from there. Since you brought up the mafia, I've begun to notice just little interesting connections over time. For instance, Rajneesh Osho, whose cult, he used a bunch of drugs in his cult, which interestingly, there was a member of the British royal family that's now sort of erased off the royal map, who was a member of his cult, Prince Welf. But his cult was the one that ran the largest bioterror attack, at least, noted bioterror attack on U.S. soil in Oregon in, the early 1980s. Poisoned hundreds of Americans just before a county election where they were trying to take over the government there. Very serious stuff, right? Well, this
They also remind me a bit of the Mormons because like there was I think there were several Netflix series on Osho. I forgot the name of the one I was watching, but
Wild Wild
like
West.
when the Mormons were like trying to set up their temple in I forget which state, they went to war with like the Americans who were living in this area, and they had like multiple wars. They had a paramilitary unit like the Mormons under John Smith. So yeah, the Osho storyline, it sounded very similar in terms of like how they were going to war with like the people who were living in these areas, and they had sort of paramilitary tactics as well that were like a little bit more subtle than during the Mormon time.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's right.
it was in
Police had
Missouri.
a hard. Sorry, go ahead.
There was the first Mormon War was in Missouri, it says online, and then there was two more right before the Civil War. But it was very similar to what the stories of Rajneesh, yeah, what we've seen with this all-out
Yeah.
battle to take over a big chunk of a state and make it a core sort of new capital of I guess, a new world religion or something. I'm not too sure what the overarching goal was of that whole ambition, but the fact that it has definite similarities. And the fact that they used bioterrorism or biowarfare, I didn't know that.
Right. Yeah. There's some of the new religious movements that have involved bioterror attacks, like the one in Japan in the Tokyo subway attacks.
Right.
So there are several of those, and people should be looking and asking if there's a connection, right? There's the psychedelic cults, and then there's the suicide cults, and these are spawned from around the time of the Fourth Great Awakening. And of course, we're entering now what's being advertised as the Great Awakening, which will be the fifth. People should take a close look at this history in order to try to understand what's going on now. But the documentary you mentioned, Wild Wild Country, I said Wild Wild West at first, Wild Wild Country, and yeah, they had more semi-automatic firepower than all the police forces in Oregon combined. So people were real careful about even approaching them. But it was the second secretary of Osho, Ma'anan Sheila, who interestingly was paraded around the talk show circuit on places like Oprah, who was always pushing these spirituality people, even those who were rapists or apologists for their sexual abuse in their communities, running baby farms, all kinds of crazy stuff. Oprah was always promoting these just mad people. But
Mm.
that was the second secretary of Osho. The third secretary was a woman named Francois Ruddy, who called herself Ma Prem Hasya. And I don't know if you know the name Francois Ruddy, but she was the wife of Albert Ruddy, who created the original Godfather movie.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
right? And so he was working with mafia
Oh,
families, talking with them
what?
about what would be presented in the movie.
Wow.
And I actually wonder then if that was, if they understood that mafia, were using sort of mind control stuff. Interestingly, he also worked for the Rand Corporation.
Wow.
Oh,
Lovely.
And
This is why I love talking to you, Matthew. I mean, Jesus, the leads you're providing here are just fantastic. Really something shocking.
yeah, Matt's just taking notes right now.
yeah, and I'm always happy to send you my graphs. By the way, this is one I'm reading that straight off of one of my graphs. Since you brought it up, but
Hmm.
the thing about MK Ultra, MK Ultra captures people's imaginations, right?
Hmm.
And of course, you get the word conspiracy theory thrown in so that people don't think enough about it, right? But it's this 149 programs, mostly in the 1950s and 1960s. But I think the more important thing is to draw it into this context of there is an entire history of these programs, and even after those 149 sub-programs of MK Ultra were themselves complete, it's right after that you get the Stanford Research Institute putting out these programs, the remote viewing program, which is the one that I came into contact with as a child, and you have the Institute for Noetic Sciences being sort of spawned from there. I think I've heard you talk. You know about them pretty well, right? I think I've heard you talk about them.
I mean, only briefly though, like the Stephen Rockefeller, Piatel de Chaldin operation. But I only summarily. I didn't really go deep into it.
I don't go. I've just started reading more about them because Willis Harman, um, and Edgar Mitchell. And Edgar Mitchell is also one of the promoters of remote viewing. There's a lot of overlap in these circles, right? And so people should look at that and wonder whether or not they are creating imagery in order to draw people into this new religion that these it seems to all go along with theosophy and the creation, of a one world religion, and the newest sphere, or I'm calling it now the cybernetic demon. Because it occurred to me that these people talking about like, raising the demon, the artificial intelligence demon, whereas in the meantime, for decades, for 80 years, going back to the Macy conferences, they've been saying, what are all the sciences that we need to put together to engineer the world into one giant machine that can then be controlled centrally.
Yeah.
And all of these programs seem to be spawned from the same circles, right? The Macy conferences, the Macy family was a Standard Oil family.
Yeah.
So that's Rockefeller stuff right there, right? And the Rockefellers, of course, also funded the Tavistock Institute. So all of these things
Also,
come to.
Josiah Macy Foundation that sponsored these things. It was the head of it, the founder, or the first president who managed this thing all the way up until the 50s. It was set up in 1930. Was this guy Churchill, Marlborough Churchill? He was the president of it. Now, Marlborough Churchill is a distant cousin of Winston Churchill, whose mother was, I believe, American. But his father goes back multi-generationally to the original Venetian takeover of England back in the 1688 period, when you had a specific Venetian party with Marlborough, or the first Earl of Marlborough, John Churchill, who was the head of the military, who oversaw the takeover of the Venetians that had a little stooge that they groomed on the throne of the Netherlands, William of Orange, that they
That
inserted.
was during Jonathan Swift's time?
That was during Jonathan Swift's time. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's the Glorious Revolution.
That's yeah. Of course, that's what they called it afterwards, right? But all that to say, that was a complete infusion of a foreign entity into really a coup that purged Britain or England of its Platonic humanists that were still of the Thomas More Erasmian bent, and they were purged by 1710. But again, the Churchill family really got its massive affluence through their role by being rewarded for their key role. Now, why am I saying this about Marlborough Churchill? Is they had a whole faction that was embedded in the American deep state. Cynthia actually wrote a piece on. Never mind. No, that's actually a side note. And so this guy was originally, how did it work? He was in charge of the Black Chamber before he sets up this thing. Now the Black Chamber, because he runs the Black Chamber from 1918 up until 1930, he's the head of that under this guy Claude Dancy. So Claude Dancy is the second in command of MI5.
Did you say Black Chamber? Apologies, I'm taking notes
Yeah,
here.
yeah, yeah. No, the Black Chamber was the name given to the most integrated military intelligence outfit that was created by the second in charge of the newly formed MI, what became MI5 and MI6. The guy was on both, and his name was Cloud Dancy. Now, Cloud Dancy was brought into America under the first Stephen Rockefeller, that had this little like outfit in Sleepy Hollow. It's the Sleepy Hollow Country Club in New York, and it still exists. It's. I think actually it's something that Washington Irving was was taking a jab at in his fictional story of Sleepy Hollow 80 years earlier. But by 1910, 1911, this was a hub, a deep state hub, which was organizing things like what became the Federal Reserve, the entire takeover. And Claude Dancy was the guy brought in to be the coordinator of this thing. It was interfacing with Crowley as well. So when Crowley was operating within the United States, setting the stage to get the U.S. sucked into World War One, actually it was Crowley who was providing intelligence to the Germans because he was acting like a double agent for the Germans, but he was always on the payroll of the British. Um, it was him who got that information that it was the Lusitania, that the Lusitania was carrying munitions, thus making it a legitimate target for attack, even though it also had passengers as part of like a false flag event that was going to supposedly the idea was to suck in the US to change the hearts and minds of the American people to support going to war with Germany. So that was part of one of Crowley's assignments. His handler was I forget the guy's name, but he was a top level official at Sleepy Hollow. Now Dancy sets up the Black Chamber, and the guy he selects is one of his prodigies, who's Marlborough Churchill in 1918. Now the Black Chamber changes its name in 1930, and the name it then takes on is the NSA. So it becomes the NSA in 1930. Now Marlborough Churchill then jumps ship and he then founds the Josiah Macy Foundation, which starts sponsoring eugenics and all the stuff that the Rockefeller Foundation is already funding. They start doing the same thing to promote eugenics in Europe and North America, and then they start becoming the thing that's the base to provide support and propaganda for cybernetics, bringing in Gregory Bateson, Margaret Mead in 1945-46 into the Macy conferences on cybernetics. And that becomes sort of the framework around which MK Ultra, that's set up in 1952 or 53, it has sort of an operating system, and cybernetics is the thing. Out of which too, you got the spinning of things like transhumanism that's infused into it, that has its own tinge on what they want the noosphere to mean. Now all of a sudden it becomes not the domain of human creative thought and discovery, which is what formerly scientists had tended to think of the noosphere from I think a more healthy standpoint, that it was like the domain of human thought, right? And creative innovation and discovery. That was then increasingly purged, and a new definition, the one that Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was pushing, this Gnostic Jesuit mystic, which was like, no, it's going to be the domain where we're gonna invoke a demonic force utilizing cybernetic like technology to that'll somehow become a self-thinking operating system that will take on a life of its own down the line, and blah blah blah. So they started ritualizing this thing in a messed up way. But yeah, this is the environment in which MK Ultra emerged.
There's also the aspect of the human potential movement that, Aldous Huxley played a big role in shaping. And again, Aldous Huxley is just a continuation of the H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell type schooling. Like Bertrand Russell's scientific outlook was pretty much the blueprint for Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. But that's the thing that, Matthew, you were well, I have to distinguish Mathew Crawford. You were talking about in terms of the tech community, where Esalen, plays a huge role in this weird kind of interpretation they have now in terms of, Gaia mixed with like tech worship, that now like Courtney Turner, she's mentioned Game B, and I've been looking into it a little bit because she mentioned it in context with Brett Weinstein, who again, like you're talking about Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, and that's Margaret Mead is part of the legacy of the Smithsonian anthropologists who were also doing like Tavistokian type things to the Native Americans in the 1800s, and you see already like the playing with the creation myths, which is what they are doing with us as well, and things like Netflix and all this. This is all just tweaking forms of creation myths, like old stories. That it's not that these stories are essentially bad, but they're being weaponized to nudge us in certain directions. But the human potential movement was this idea that it's sort of like this, again, will to power concept. So you have like, the kind of Nazi, more militant, I guess, idea of the will to power, but you have also this other aspect of it, which is the human potential movement, which is now what is really shaping, people like Gameby, the game theorist type people, but they think that they can also affect their evolution as well. So Brett Weinstein is also, he's really into this, like the Smithsonian Institute with Lewis Henry Morgan, which Lewis Henry Morgan pretty much wrote the Bible for the Smithsonian Institute, which gave birth to, the science of anthropology, which I don't really consider a science. It's a fraud. But he wrote oh, I'm forgetting now the name of the books. One was The League of the Iroquois, and the other one was, I think, Ancient Society or something like that. But these were the Bibles for the Smithsonian, and actually those Frederick Engels himself said that he was directly influenced by how Lewis Henry Morgan was thinking about organizing society through these concepts of evolution theory. And it was a tweaking of Darwinism that, again, it's very interesting that, you had Engels and Marx who were influenced by this. And I'm not surprised, at all by that. But that is the continuation of what Brent Weinstein is talking about as well. And if you read Lewis Henry Morgan's works, it is a form of like Arianism, justified with a pseudoscience of evolutionary theory. And now you see, people like Brett Weinstein or like Jordan Hall with the deep code for Gameby, where they're talking in this new sexy way that the younger generations think is an actual science, and they can't recognize it as a continuation of stuff we already went through as like the crazy ideas of the early, 20th century, where now we're like, oh, I would never be a eugenicist. And it's like, and so they have all of these ugly ideas, but they're kind of like, sugarcoating it with this all like sexy tech Gaia talk.
Mm.
And again, it's this idea of shaping, the evolution of the species. And you hear like people like Powell, who was the director of the Bureau of Ethnology, which was basically what was in charge of the Smithsonian Institute, and the kinds of crazy ideas that were coming out of these institutions, where they're saying that the evolution of the species, because they were trying to get back into imperialism, right? The United States during its better times was anti-imperialistic. So this was actually a huge goal of the Smithsonian Institute, to return back to imperialism by using an evolutionary argument of why it was just natural. You had phases of society, and the Native Americans were just the lower, phase of like evolutionary thought pattern. But with advanced civilization, it was natural that you would be imperialistic. And the fate of the Native American, there's tons of disgusting quotes from these people that even the biographer of the Smithsonian Institute, Curtis Hinsley, who wrote Of Savages and Scientists, he is still pro-Smithsonian, but he has to acknowledge that they were incredibly racist, and they would say it was the fate of the Native American to die out, because they were just, unfortunately, on the lower level of consciousness, and they would just not be able to survive, and they could not be incorporated into an advanced civilization, because they were almost like a different species in terms of thought level. So it's just another excuse for why you had to have these policies of genocide that were supposed to be now scientifically justified. But there was this other weird thing where they thought that the white race, because it's imperialistic and it will conquer, its race will be the dominant evolutionary race. So even if you mix with other races, your race will kind of like be the dominant race through this mixing, which is also, you know,
Mm.
I guess maybe Jesuits thought of themselves as doing that as well. I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny that you brought up the Jesuits at the end because I know that that a lot of the a lot of what I've read about Jesuits was them mixing with people in the Americas and sort of like seemingly kind of steering their culture. And when I'd read about that, I kind of
You know,
thought,
for people to know too, the Smithsonian Institute is the 16 ray sun, and the Jesuits' symbol is the 32 ray sun. So for me, that's a little bit of a tipping off of the hat, but
Hmm.
ah, interesting. Okay. Um, but I actually wondered if Frank Herbert named the Bene Gesserit to point to the Jesuits.
yeah, I heard you bringing that up, and we had already thought about that when we watched the first Dune movie, which is really well done, but you know, clearly I feel nudging people in a really bad direction. But yeah, that's how
Yeah,
we.
I feel like it's interesting, and I think this matters in terms of the discussion that we're having too. I think they left out the most important scene in the movie, or the most important quote in the movie when Paul's going through the Gom Jabbar, right?
That's when he's on
Madam,
his drug thing, his voyage, or
no, when he has the needle, he
okay.
puts his hand in
Oh,
the
right.
Oh, okay, yeah, the paint thing. Yeah, right.
so he's being tested there, and the explanation for the test is left out. But when you
Mm.
read the book, you get the explanation by you know, I don't know, like Madame Gaia Mohias or whatever her name is, and she explains the test as they're sifting for humans, right? The what the Bene Gesserit are doing with their breeding program is trying to create humans who are sort of game theoretically superior.
Right,
And
right,
if your
right.
hand is caught in a trap, an animal who gets caught in a trap might just chew its leg off. And that's better than nothing, but it's an instinct reaction. It's not warning your species. The person who is strong enough, to lay the trap, perhaps destroy the person who set the trap or something like that, like lay in wait or leave some sort of a mark to warn their tribe, their empire, their species. That would be sort of like the next level of humanity. And so that's what she's sifting for, right?
Hmm, hmm.
So anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting. It's a eugenics breeding program, is what it
Yeah,
is.
yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what it is, right? Yeah, and it's very multi-generational. Yeah, on that note, the like when you look at the underpinnings of transhumanism, since that's become more of a common word for people in the recent years for obvious reasons, maybe some still don't know, but not only do you have to go to its previous incarnation of eugenics, but it's very lawful that you see that eugenics is the natural application of the Darwinian mechanisms or the Darwinian model explaining evolution's course from lower to higher forms of life. And it's not like Darwin was the only model available at the time in the 19th century. There were many more. And when you look at some of these other models that were being proposed to explain the discrepancies of the fossil records, there's many more competent people that are not Darwin that were approaching explanatory mechanisms that involved purpose, design, directionality, non-randomness as causal, whereas Darwin was forcing you to assume that random mutations was causal. That no direction was possible when you're dealing with evolution. Darwin outright rejects that. Oh yeah, go on, Cynthia.
Just a quick note that Lewis Henry Morgan, that's how he treated, advanced civilization, that the overall direction, that everything was random from the Darwinian biological standpoint, but then when it came to society, it wasn't so random, but then he contradicted himself because they wanted just, uh, you know, say that imperialism is the right way to go. So they said the American Republic was a random outcome.
Oh no. Yeah, no, don't look at ideas,
It's
please.
a mutation.
Right. Oh, that's lovely. That's how they did it. It's just more complex. It's not better or worse. It's just more complex. It's just right. Rolling of
It's
the
a
Actually,
mutation that distracted from the overall outcome, which is the natural outcome, which is imperialism.
which is ironic, right? Because it broke from imperialism, but yet he believes that it's more natural that America become imperialistic. So he's actually contradicting himself on that level if he's saying that.
It's
Imperialism,
just self-serving. That's why it's not science. All
yeah.
actually wondered
right.
if the Constitution in the U.S. government was that the American experiment. so to speak, was
Mm-hmm.
possibly a long form test, right? What could a society do legally to stop infiltration by a network? As much as I now sort of use the phrasing of, the British Empire as the globalist empire, but of course, these things go back, is it the Venetian Empire? Is it the Phoenician Empire? I actually think that it's a network, and that network has gobbled up people wherever it's gone to bring into their network, to intermarry and whatnot, but that it is sort of a shadow government, and then all the nation states, they bend them to their will and make them as illusory as possible. They know how to get control of the levers of each government, and that whether or not Benjamin Franklin and crew were creating a set of defenses against a network parasite, or whether or not it was allowed to happen that way. That one way or another, it serves as a long form test of the parasitic shadow government, to see how long it would take to infiltrate, and I think we're probably seeing the late stages of that experiment.
Oh, well,
You had brought up this black chamber, which is now something I want to go research and read about. But it sparked some additional connections in my mind. Can we go back to that?
what can I finish
Oh
one
yeah, yeah,
current that I
absolutely.
want to jump on before we round it out because it deals with the bloodlines and transhumanism, and I was just like sort of thinking about what was going on around that time. And one of the things that you discover is that amongst those grand strategists of the empire that are managing, like Darwin, for example, Thomas Huxley, who's the handler of Darwin, he creates something called the X Club, so you have a centralized body, sort of a command controlled body with experts that are masters of, or sold, at least marketed as high priests or masters of particular domains of science, chemistry and optics and archaeology, even sociology. Matthew Arnold is in it, uh, and they're all sort of convening around a conquest of all of the different aspects of human knowledge, every single science, but reinterpreted in a imperial Darwinian friendly interpretation that presumes only gradualism, adaptation as mechanisms, not creative changes that we actually see as evidence in the fossil records. We don't see gradualism slowly changing. You see discontinuous. There is definitely adaptation in as a mechanism, no doubt, but transcending that in the longer wave of fossil records, what we see are these discontinuous leaps and systems coming into being, systems disappearing,
Like
and
the formation of wings.
the formation of wings being a great example, which takes a while for a species to appear in the fossil records that demonstrates a capacity to actually fly. So it seems like there's effort to try to like express something as a function, but it takes time for it to achieve a design that kind of
And
works.
it occurred in multiple spots in the world, which couldn't account for a direct connection.
Oh yeah,
Like they
right.
were all, yeah, it was all happening in different parts of the world around the same time.
Beautifully
Could,
said.
could
Yeah,
you enable screen sharing, because you inspired a graph that I put together on this subject?
yeah. You are now co-host.
I'm gonna be right back.
Oh, okay. All right.
So, I had heard you talk about Club X, which, I mean, or the X Club, excuse me. Was it the X Club or Club X? There's the X Club and Camp X,
I think,
right?
yeah, the X Club. Yeah.
So, when you mentioned that, and I kind of thought about like Elon Musk's, intent of making, PayPal into X.com and all this stuff. I actually like stepped back and I wondered how many of these different institutions are sort of named X. And X, it's a real simple thing to hide behind because, of course, it's the most common variable name, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's so in mathematics, but it's chi, right? It's a lot of symbolism and a lot of other things. But where is it that we wind up seeing it in our popular culture? Planet X, is there this other planet out there that's dark and hidden? The X Files. You've got Malcolm X, and even like people around Malcolm X, like who threw X into their name, like Norman 3X Butler, which is Thomas 15X Johnson. I don't even know what those numbers come from or mean or something, but it may have been some sort of internal code. But obviously we see this all over the money and technology industry right now. Ledger X. There's a Google X.
Yeah, they like X a lot. Agreed. I agree with you. You got. I acquiesce.
So anyway,
Yes.
I
X-Men.
created
Well, one
this.
thing I'll throw in there, X-Men too. Like I was reading the Estlin book, the official biography of the Estlin Institute, which grows out of the human potential movement that you were referring to, Cynthia, of the Aldous Huxley lectures that Michael Murphy and what's his name were following. And in this official biography by this guy Jeffrey Kripal, he makes a point. He's obsessed with the X-Men. He's like, isn't it interesting that the Estlin Institute, what's essentially a special school to enhance the next phase of human evolution by developing psychic telepathic powers with the help of like sacred orgies and drugs and crap. It came out in the same month as Marvel Comics produced X-Men. And he's like, he says this like 8 times in the damn book, and it's creepy. And who's the head of the X-Men? Like, who's the trainer of the X-Men?
Francis Xavier.
Francis Xavier, the guy who's managing Loyola, Ignatius Loyola's key, I guess, lieutenant is
Comes back to the Jesuits.
coming back to the Jesuits. Yeah.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah, there's clearly something to this connection between the circles, and I think there are several, of course, like all these different Earth organizations, right? I think that it's part of the code by which these connections operate, and by which people are sort of like given responsibility of one little piece of culture, or one organization, or something like that to push the spins of spins. I guess as it would be called in the Aquarian conspiracy. Wow.
Mm-hmm. Now, the thing I was really wanting to get at with the transhumanist evolution thing is when you look at, and also the hereditary bloodlines, how disingenuous this is, how they try to market this as a science. Um, Edward Bulwer Lytton. So Edward Bulwer Lytton's book, what is it? The
The
Zanoni
coming race.
and the
Sorry, go
Coming
ahead.
Race. Two. Zanoni in 1841 or something, and then the Coming Race. He wrote a little bit after that. His works are so influential on so many levels. Like this is like sacred for the higher level occultists, including Madame Blavatsky, who was super influenced by Zanoni's works. Her mother was the direct translator of of Bulwer Lytton's works into Russian. It wasn't just her grandpa's connection. Uh,
Whoa, wow.
yeah,
This,
yeah,
this is another connection because I discovered that Bulwer Lytton's family married into the Theosophical Society later on, right?
oh
Which
yeah,
it totally annihilates the story that Bulwer Lytton was like, no, 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 this is just a science fiction work. After Madame Blavatsky insisted on canonizing the coming race, right? He was like, no, 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 it's just a science fiction work. They're not interpreting right, but there are all these connections then between him and these spiritualists who are creating this. So
yeah,
I think that he is in on a longer term plan, and allowing for like not thought terminating cliche, but thought terminating, I don't know, deflection.
yeah.
Uh,
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And like H.G. Wells was.
Wait, you have to finish that the Harry Potter film was filmed at his mansion.
Oh well, his castle. He has a family
Yeah,
castle.
his castle, his family castle. Obviously, he's not alive anymore, but they chose that as the location for Harry Potter, which I think is not by
wow.
chance.
No, that's not it. Also, the Batman movie, but especially the Harry Potter movie. Like, so the Tim Burton movies, Batman's were also filmed in there, but the Harry Potters, yeah, were all filmed inside his castle. I forgot the name. It's a stupid name. Anyway, this thing, one of the conditions in the Zanoni book, which is the story of a Rosicrucian immortal, kind of like a vampire. Like these are the types of ideas that spawned the vampire mythos. In fact, Bram Stoker was a follower of Lytton in two. So Bram Stoker was a follower of Lytton. He was also a member of the Golden Dawn, a Rosicrucian order. Lytton was a high level Rosicrucian. Anyway, so they're utilizing science fiction. They're innovating this as far as creating a space for a general template for the minds of game masters to move within. So there's certain core assumptions within their creative fiction that went on. It was already happening way before the modern age of it was already going on back then. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because this Zanoni book that is so influential to Blavatsky and so many others, and Crowley has this on one of his top 10 books. Um, it this you can only be taught, initiated into the higher order that this high level vampire type characters is trying to find, a young initiate. One of the conditions is you have to have bloodlines that are royal. You can't even begin to learn how to use these arts of higher mind powers, of telepathy, channeling, all this stuff. You can't do it if you're not part of, if you don't have some element or some proportion of royal blood inside of you. And then it's hereditary, it's passed on genetically. And thus the vast majority of the people are presumed thus to be forever. They can't even begin to be taught, as in the case with Harry Potter, within the story of the this whole school of Hogwarts, the invisible college, as the Rosicrucians call it, which you go into. The kids can only be
The
taught
Tavistock
magic.
also associated themselves with that.
Avistock associated themselves, called themselves the Invisible College, as you pointed out in your new piece. Uh, if you don't have magician's blood, or what is it, sorcerer's wizardry inside of your family.
Or a mutation. Maybe your parents are muggles, but like in X-Men, you have a mutation and suddenly you can be inducted in or something like that.
That's Thomas Huxley.
Yeah.
That's
Do
Thomas
you
Huxley's.
guys have the protein, Cynthia? Do you have the X pro the special psychic protein? What's on my notebook? Oh man.
X.
Oh, wait, but that what you're saying is so good, because that's what Thomas Huxley got pissed at, because Thomas Huxley is from like a poor family who doesn't have any like royal blood, but he's got visceral creativity and talent and a biting hatred for humanity, because he saw like crazy syphilis patients, when he was like a medical doctor when he was young. And so he just starts developing this misanthropy and creativity, and the oligarchy needs him. They like need that vitality, and he's got a patron who brings him into the Royal Society, because he has the talent that the oligarchy lacks, because they just get kind of too comfy in their castles. And so he's pissed, because he's like, look, your problem. He's overseeing a reorganization, a corporate reorganization of the empire, because he's like, look, you need a new philosophy that allows talent like me and my student H.G. Wells, born of like a pauper, like a gardener's kid, to have influence that currently you don't have. And so this is where H.G. Wells and Huxley are really, really pushing on the Darwinian interpretation of random mutations to explain how, maybe like you just said, somebody from a shit like a lowborn could feasibly be brought in, and a George Soros could be rewarded by being granted his own little mini micro dynasty under conditions, and have the special powers that only the higher ups previously had privilege to.
Yeah, you find a Gandhi and train him up at the Inner Temple, and he must have had the X gene or something.
Mm.
Wow. Um, it, um, all of this takes an incredible amount of organization.
Mm.
Uh, these organizations, the spins of spins, the financial organizations, and you had brought up the Black Chamber earlier, which is something I for some reason I don't know that term. I'm going to have to go back and research this, but I will mention this that before the NSA, where cryptography that was done within American intelligence was the Navy, right? And you can imagine, boats, ships, submarines, you're transporting messages long distance before you have a telegraph or a telephone or an internet. Um, but of course, the Navy seems to be tied more closely to the power structures that did wind up taking over the world and all that. But um, Black Chamber.
Okay.
Well, now you've got Black Rock, you've got, Dark Brandon versus Dark MAGA and all this kind of stuff. I've been trying to look into what's going on with BlackRock, but I have a theory about it, which all these ETFs which feed into BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, basically reduce voting power of people who feel like they have ownership investing through these you know uh, conglomerate organizations, where in reality these conglomerate organizations are actually accruing all the voting interest, and then they own within each other, and then, well, who actually owns enough of any one of them to pull a lever and vote for a corp, to vote within like whatever a corporation is doing. And if they have that, then they have it for all corporations at once, which is how you could do something, for instance, like have all corporations have the same exact messaging for culture wars, the same exact messaging for a pandemic. And I think that it all goes back to the British Empire. In fact, when you look at the first conglomerate organizations, um, oh, I can't remember the name, but the very first one, who's one of the people from it, like spun off and then created Vanguard.
Mm.
But the very first one, I don't know if it was called like Winchester or Windsor or something like that, but it was in Boston. It was like a clear nod to, British power.
Mm.
And I think that's part of what that symbolism. I think the X symbolism, the black symbolism, black water, black rock, and the Earth Gaia symbolism are all parts of that same group, and doing all of that.
Well, definitely based on what you've just said, the signals intelligence, that is the black chamber. So as soon as it was set up in 1918, it was designed to be signals intelligence in the American military. And one thing that I noted in I'm just finishing up a new book on the occult Tesla, going through the darker underpinnings of what was managing Nikola Tesla as a person, as well as like what was
Yeah,
um
I'm enjoying that series.
it's about to come together with the last chapter now, but this is where it came in, is that at the time it seemed like the patriots inside of America that were fighting against this deep state penetration were, during World War One, there was a faction that had taken a good deal of influence over U.S. naval intelligence, and it was this grouping that wrote a report that discovered that the German financed Tesla towers, both of them in Long Island, there's not one but two, were used by Aleister Crowley and Crowley's assistant George Sylvester Virake, two occultists who were Sylvester Virake was the best friend of Tesla, and it was Tesla who managed these towers that was providing a means of communication with a sister tower that they hypothesized uh, was run by Nazi intelligence. And it was
Oh, J.P. Morgan financed those towers.
financed the first one in Colorado, and then you had, I think, Astor finance. I'm confusing who financed what. I know at a certain point the funding did dry up for one of them, but for the other one, the Germans were funding it, and that's the one that nobody ever talks about. Nobody ever talks about it. It was a German company that was directly funding one of the two towers that were demolished in 1917. So they destroyed both of them, and again, it seems like there was a bit of a coup that Cloud Dancy, who was overseeing MI5, and he was the guy managing things on the ground in America through the Sleepy Hollow Club. He's the guy who trained Marlborough Churchill, and then they created the Black Chamber to take a lot of the functions of what was formerly in U.S. naval intelligence and remove it to this other agency that then became the NSA, because they had to get rid of this troublesome grouping inside of the U.S. military, and that was around Franklin Roosevelt at the time, because Roosevelt was the guy who was at the time still the head of the Navy. I forget the official title. What's the official title of that? Doesn't matter. I
There's
forget.
a Secretary of the Navy at the Pentagon, but I don't
Secretary,
know what.
I guess he was the Secretary of the Navy then. But he was the one getting direct briefings by this grouping that was calling out, that was discovering the whole Crowley networks in America that had deep penetrations into Washington. And I think he used a lot of that information and intelligence when he came back to fight them after he got polio, which might have been an attack. Come to think of it, it probably wasn't polio the way we were told. There was probably something else. But when he came back in action, he had a very effective means of taking down a lot of these networks that he understood because of his former role in World War One dealing with it. Even though they ended up ultimately killing him, there was still quite interesting how he was able to navigate through things that otherwise normal people shouldn't have known how to do that. So yeah, that's just what I'm associating with the Black Chamber so far. It is cipher intelligence. It's also what Edgar Allan Poe was doing too. Edgar Allan Poe was part of a military intelligence network of patriots, in the 1830s, 1840s. He was also doing ciphers, all sorts of things in his Gold Bug short story. It's a cipher, and he's basically just teaching people how everybody can learn how to decrypt. everybody, and he's making it popular, which is making him problematic for the occultists that are trying to take over, and he's not making it easy for them.
Interesting. And well, one day I'll show you this, but I invented my own form of cryptography, trying to think about like whether or not, we were going to be controlled by people who could, fully crack all of the different forms, like especially once quantum computing advances further, which
Mm.
I don't think it's going to advance fast enough to like to be worrisome in the next 10 years or anything like that. But um, so this whole connection through the Navy, one of the reasons that I believe that there is a network is the amount of interaction there is between the British and the Germans. I think that it is a network that encompasses both countries, even though it's more, London based. And, Crowley went to Germany and took over the OTO, and he did it in like the blink of an eye, right? It's kind of like the way the Theosophical Society, it was founded, and then like 13 seconds later, there were 22 lodges all over London, right? No, like there's clearly something, being organized before that point. But Crowley winds up at the head of it, and then he knows German language and culture so well he can fool the German spies in New York into thinking that he's German. So I'm going to say maybe, maybe not. As I was reading into a lot of the things that we're talking about, and in particular when I was researching Rajneesh Osho's cult, I came across an interesting story about First Sea Lord John Rushworth Jellicoe, and he was one of the oh gosh, what was the name of the ships? Was it not Juggernaut? What were the names of like the post Ironclad, like the World War One era, um, metal plated uh
Drag dreadnoughts.
dreadnoughts. Thank you, dreadnoughts, right? There was never a dreadnought battle in history, right? Those things were retired, and better battleships were made or whatever by World War II. But there was a confrontation when Jellicoe was commanding one that bumped up against a German one, and it looks, reading the documentation about it, it looks like he could have just taken it out. And but he said that he wanted to approach cautiously, and the German dreadnought ran away. But his story was apparently not believable enough to enough people that he wasn't removed. He was the top admiral commanding a ship in the Navy, and he was removed from that position after that moment. But it's like there are all these questions always about the Navy being this conduit by which these networks seem to operate and have power.
Mm.
Weirdly interesting. His son was George Jellicoe, who was then a British parliamentarian, MP. I think and I don't know exactly what his positions were, but he handled more important stuff than your average politician. But he was also contemporary peer with Robert Maxwell. But the reason I came across all those names to begin with was that his daughter, the granddaughter of First Sea Lord, is a woman named Lady Zara Jellicoe, who was one of the neo-sannyasins in Oregon.
Wow. She's like
You
one of
know,
the top
Um,
damsels in the Osho group.
yeah, yeah.
Huh. Yeah, no, there's I mean, you don't want to. Yeah, no, that's interesting points, interesting data points you're bringing up.
So can I draw us back to the big picture of the seed of this conversation? Because we talked about MK Ultra, and originally, like I think I'd pinged Cynthia on an article, and I was like, I'd love to discuss MK Ultra with you guys one day. But it always occurs to me when I start to think about this and contextualize it, that obviously like the larger goal is simply control. Like it's world control, it's world domination, right? And MK Ultra is just one compartmentalized set of programs that was seated within the U.S. government, the CIA, and military intelligence. But that we can see its connection to this larger sphere of projects, even if we don't have an official connection. And here's kind of what I mean. MK Ultra was mostly focused on individuals. What happens if we dose them with LSD? What happens if we dose them with dozens of different chemicals and drugs were tested within these programs? LSD was just the one that they thought was generally more interesting. But ultimately, what they need is group psychology, group behavior, and you begin
Hmm.
to have tangential relationships to things like the Manson family,
Mhm.
and whether or not a person can control a group. And of course he was Scientology trained, and he seemed to have like CIA and intelligence protection. But I have a reader who came on and was a whistleblower in a sense about Werner Erhard's EST and landmark forum programs, these sort of corporate coaching cults. And she and I have been discussing this over the last year or so. She's an expert in large group awareness training, LGAT, and large group awareness training. Of course, this sort of is spawned from people like Werner Erhard, and he was a Scientologist. He was also somebody who brought money to the Stanford Research Institute to create that remote viewing program,
Mm.
right, that we talked about. But what's going on with these large group awareness training programs? Ultimately, when you take a look at what's going on, I think that it's sort of group cult building and mind control, but it's de-patterning and repatterning. You mentioned like Gregory Bateson, who is responsible for the double bind theory of schizophrenia, where you have ultimately two directives that contradict, and ultimately it's severe enough that the mind splits, and then you can have multiple personalities and alters, and perhaps you can learn to use and train one of those alters. Heard Courtney Turner talk about, and I want to look this one up because I'm really curious how one can have a severe allergy that the other one doesn't even have. That's fascinating. But ultimately, what these are, like, you've got these public self-reflection and transformation events, right? Like people who are like going through a Tony Robbins program, or at Nixium used a lot of these sorts of tactics. You had people sort of publicly doing therapy, right? And I think that it's about the therapy experience being necessarily connected to the group experience, and therefore a person, to whatever degree each of us has narcissistic traits or something like that, which I do think we have to struggle with because it's inherent in our educational systems, right? They push us in that way, and then we have to do our best to sift through that, right? But you have all these witnesses to what's going on. This was actually part of what was going on at the camp in the program that I grew up in, that I've written a little bit about, and I wish I had time to write more about it. But so you've got what it is it's Oprah, right? It's talk shows. I think that literally the talk show circuit was created
Mm.
for part of this suite of mind control programs,
You mean
because
like the or like the Maury Povich type shows and stuff like that as well?
right. And in fact, when you start looking, actually, I've got a graph on this that I'm going to bring up just so that I can mention some names, because I don't necessarily have them all, memorized off the top of my head. But, when you look through a whole bunch of the talk show hosts were in the military, and some of them specifically in military intelligence, more in on the naval side than anywhere, right? And here are some examples. Johnny Carson was Navy, Jesse Ventura was a SEAL, Montel Williams, who had dated Kamala Harris later, was naval intelligence. Steve Bannon reported to the Secretary of the Navy. Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes was naval intelligence. Robert Osborne, Phil Donahue, David Letterman, Jerry Springer, Steve Wilco.
Whoa.
And this was actually just me going through for like an hour one day. I have no idea how far this extends. I just started, taking notes just to begin to see, right? And there are also people with CIA connections as well. Anderson Cooper, Merv Griffin, Tom Braden from Crossfire. But you can see this large group awareness training style that's going on, and the fact that it was created by people who were consistently popping out of either the same like human potential movement stuff. Oprah's spiritual advisor, Marianne Williamson, keeps running for president, but I think that's really just to have the extra media and attention and all that. But
Mm.
um, uh, these same programs are what are being applied within these programs like social emotional learning and DEI, DEI training. When you listen to people describe it, it's the same thing, right? It's public confessional, and then turning to the group and this is how I will do better, and this is how I will have my transformation. You have the depatterning, and then you have the repatterning, and there's a trauma experience involved. And
Mhm.
I think that like I said, MK Ultra was for individuals, but what they want to do is create this global religion. So they had to learn depatterning and repatterning in mass media,
Mhm.
and it'll make instant sense when you hear this. But of course, television and later the internet, you can use the same tactics, but television was really the thing that really allowed them to get there, right? You've probably heard that when people watch TV, the thing that is disabled is your prefrontal cortex. And the faster moving the storyline is, the harder it is for your brain to manage its normal executive functions. And those are the executive functions. That's where you're tapping into your moral programming, what it is that the values that have been transmitted to you vertically are being interfered with horizontally. If you understand what I mean, right? The values that your elders, your parents, your church, or whatever have given you are being interfered with horizontally. Your attention and focus are so taken away. But specifically, the things that are harmed are your emotional learning, your social behavior, and your working memory, right? Social emotional learning.
Mhm.
I don't think that this is a coincidence in
Yeah.
any way, shape, or form. This and of course, social emotional learning is a program that is pushed out through the United Nations, and it's run by a guy named uh, Muller, who was a theosophist.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, he was a
So,
follower of Alice Bailey. Yeah.
right, one of the acolytes of Alice Bailey. And so, if what you want is guided evolution of culture, that would be the way to roll it out. and
Mhm.
and I think that it's important to start putting together to convince people to pay attention to this model,
Mhm.
mass depatterning, mass repatterning through these programs. If you can
Mhm.
warn enough people, maybe we can fend it off, maybe we can fight it off, right? But I
Think
think that ultimately this is the culture from which governance is downstream.
Yeah, and I think that an aspect of this is, this whole communal living push, which, if you look at a lot of these types like Aldous Huxley, again, but many other players, they really push this communal living and like, D.H. Lawrence, who was a sort of guru for Aldous Huxley, he had his ranch, in a desert in the United States. I forgot which state. Aldous Huxley would also do this. He'd get his ranch in the middle of a desert. They always needed a ranch in the middle of a desert, and this focus on communal living. And I think that, again, Aldous Huxley was not just coming up with these ideas on his own. He was a part of networks that seemed to be totally connected with Tavistock, which they were talking about therapeutic communities. Tavistock was doing research on groupthink type aspects, which was also brought into Vietnam with the Operation Phoenix program very directly. Like Tavistock coined the term Operation Phoenix before it became known in Vietnam, and there are different treatments, right, for different types. You could think of like a Brave New World. You have the alpha, you have the betas, and then you have the deltas and epsilons and so forth. So you're going to have different kinds of group think or therapeutic communities, re-education camps, these kinds of things, depending on the level of grouping that you're dealing with. And so again, like Aldous Huxley in his Brave New World, they have like those group sessions, right? The therapy sessions where people are, it's like a cult. You're encouraged to kind of like vent out some whatever. There's chanting involved, there's a rhythm that everyone needs to sing, and then it unleashes total orgiastic chaos, and you're supposed to end it with an orgy. And that's for the alpha beta grouping in Brave New World. And so this idea of therapeutic communities that Tavistock was spearheading, again, Courtney Turner should have had Courtney Turner on. We're like mentioning her so much, but she had a great guest on her show. I forgot, unfortunately, the name of the guest, but he was talking about the connections with Tavistock, Operation Phoenix, with like the Jim Jones cult. But it seems like cults more generally, that was a model that was brought in. So these cults were one of the forms of therapeutic communities that they were experimenting on. And it made me think again of Aldous Huxley's last book, which was supposed to be like his great work since Brave New World, which was The Island. And The Island is all about, again, this concept of therapeutic community. And I remember reading it at the time, it was years ago. I didn't know anywhere near as much as I do now. It sounds very harmless, right? Like, oh, it takes a village, to raise a kid. And that's not bad. Like, you shouldn't be isolated in society, and you should have friends and family who help you out. But they, really manipulate that kind of, natural healthy thing in terms of the a kind of controlled therapeutic community that they want, with again these Brave New World elements in it, which again Brave New World was also very evolutionary bent as well. And so these people who are really like romanticizing communal living, I feel that that's a total trap that you're being set up. You're walking voluntarily into what they want us all to be
Right.
ultimately in the final outcome.
Mm.
Right. And a lot of that construction is what would go on in a church anyway, right? And then you just add a few monkey wrenches into the gears and you give it different wording, and I had a conversation with an Orthodox Christian maybe 6 weeks ago. Really good kid. He's about 20 years old or 19 or 20. And we were talking about demons. And if you'd asked me if I believed in demons 5 years ago, I would have just gone, yeah, whatever. I had long ago rejected like paranormal phenomena or thinking in terms of things that sounded superstitious to me. But when I started thinking about this like de-patterning and repatterning, suddenly it occurred to me, oh, maybe the idea of exorcism was made into a cartoon for me, but that perhaps what that was always about was a person having a some sort of a mental feedback loop that is so dislodged that it
Mm.
becomes something that is internally harmful within the community, even if it feeds itself, even if it's able to be stable, and get along in life, or uh, uh, you understand what I mean? As an individual, it may be stable, but it's harmful to the community. And then something that is exorcistic would be something that would bring the patterning back
Mm.
to its like native pattern, its stable pattern. But if you raise kids with another pattern, then there's nothing to push. There's no exorcistic, moment that you can push it back to what it would have been. This is the thing, actually. And for years, I kind of, wasn't talking about it publicly very much because it was very hard for me to put into words, and I hadn't stumbled along the right things to explain to people. And I didn't know that the lawsuit with the quasi cult that I grew up in, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, I didn't know that that would ever happen. I thought that I was really just bumping up against a wall explaining this to people, but I'll explain to you the technique that's used right now, because I think that it will help a lot of people put this in context with the big picture, with what is actually going on here, right? With these mind control projects. So there's a camp, and thank God I never went to it, but in Virginia Beach, where a lot of people in the ARE would send their children, right? And I don't know exactly what the age span was, but I'm just going to throw out like 10 to 17. I don't quite know for sure, 10 to 18. It's definitely going to be a lot of high school kids. So at this camp, I think mostly girls would be targeted, but they would be molested or assaulted, raped. I know it was different in different situations for different people, but then the person who had been assaulted the next day would, like stand up in front of the entire group, the entire community, and would forgive their attacker
Oh my God.
face to face, right? Like clearly this is torture, right? This is very, it's trauma inducing as a pattern, because it forces a person with these two major conflicting directives. I think this is directly trying to induce double-bind schizophrenia. Within the ARE community, within a lot of these theosophy communities, you're taught like infinite forgiveness, like unconditional love, unconditional forgiveness. Um, and this winds up butting heads with, what it is that you would accept, within your community, but specifically it's coming from someone with a power differential, someone further higher up. And uh and so, to reject this, you're having to then reject a core piece of your religion, and possibly reject your entire community with it.
Yeah.
This seems to be again the Mormon model too. The Mormons seem to use that.
I've heard, and I interviewed a woman a few weeks ago, about 2 months ago, whose father had left the Mormon church and raised them under, a branch of Christianity. And she was saying that, you don't know how bad it is here, that, the human trafficking networks in Utah are just, it's all over, it's everywhere. And I think that this is ultimately the model of governance. I call it governance by aggressive, nonsensical guruism, gang governance, that they're trying to be able to have, these spins, that are everywhere, but governing that way. And I think this also explains their fascination with Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism. When you go back in history, when you actually look at what Tibet was North Korea before North Korea, right? This like happy, lovey-dovey image that we have of the Dalai Lama is this total fiction. When you go back and read what was going on, you know, the Lamas would have a lot of slaves, but everybody else would be a serf. The Lamas owned, the vast majority of the land in the country, and everybody was just bringing the spoils of the labor to them. And they were living like, they had I believe they have one of the lowest IQ levels in the world, and this is sort of covered up by the fact that they're, technically part of China in some sense now. But like India, there's almost nowhere other than sub-Saharan Africa where you have such, resource deprivation, where you have lower IQs, because almost everybody's living close to starvation level, right? And the llamas could come in if they wanted to. They could just take your children, as toys. They would make their drums out of the skins of like 6-year-old boys
Human
and
Yeah,
centipede.
I've heard
stuff.
they had lanterns made out of human skin.
Yeah. Yeah, the Nazis found they were fascinated by this, and the Nazis ended up taking on certain practices that they tried back in Germany, utilizing the skins of those who died in the camps who had tattoos, and even now there's thousands of lamps and other weird paraphernalia that the Nazis were making using human skin, aesthetically, that they were learning these techniques from the llamas, yeah, in Tibet, which
And
had
then I think that this feeds into the use of like talk shows, for instance. And later, I think that there's also room in here for like reality TV and video games, and a lot of the video game publishers have military intelligence connections. And there's one called Ultima, where you have like this sort of like lead avatar, or sort of lead god within the system, Lord British. And that it's if you've never seen it before, it's actually worth like just taking a peek at. They even use like the runes. Um,
Mm.
you read them. You would learn to read the runes in order to read signs in the map that they would give you in the game. I played like one and a half of these games when I was a kid, and it's fantastic. But I didn't understand what it was trying to, impart, right?
yeah,
So very well made.
yeah.
But
Oh,
going
this
back to the talk,
Underworld. You're talking about Underworld?
well, there
Oh,
was an underworld in the game, yes. And I had, oh, it's funny, I didn't even remember that aspect of it, but now I can
because I'm
connect
looking it
to
up right
the
now on
Vril
the
Society.
internet.
That's Vril stuff.
Real
But yeah,
real stuff, like they're using an energy to have
Oh.
mind power over robots and stuff, and like telepathy or telekinesis or
um, there was some like psi magic type stuff in the game, like, but more just on the level of what you would think of as Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah,
Um,
I actually played that game too. It didn't fully register until I looked it up just now. I played like one of the earlier versions where the technology for video games was still pretty bad.
yeah, stick figure with a stick sword moving around. Yeah, I think I played like versions 5 and 6 of that game. But ultimately, if you're inserting all of these sort of elements in during childhood, you don't have to do depatterning and repatterning later. You just have to add the pattern ingredient. But on the like this bind that people are in where they accept abuse, where they accept literally up to torture, right? Like things that would be that you would think would be intolerable to your dignity and character. When you look, I mean, even just and I did a very brief observation of who had been on Oprah. Right. I haven't done any kind of deep dive. This was just me messing around for 30 minutes. Of course, you've got the Dalai Lama, you've got Tom Cruise from Scientology, a bunch of other Scientologists too, Esther Hicks, John, or no, she's not Scientology, John Travolta, Lisa Marie Presley. But you've got, Ma Anand Sheila, as I mentioned, but then you've got people like Pema Chodron, who follows this Tibetan Buddhist master, Changyam Trungpa, and he's one of the several lamas that it came out, was raping, sexually assaulting, his followers that he would draw in and then, use them. And she basically was just like, well, somebody told me that, it's like she kind of acted like, well, I don't know if that's true, but if somebody told me he did that, I would just be like, whatever. That was basically her response to that, right?
What
Yeah.
And
was the name, Matt, of that guy that she had on who he actually had women who were like imprisoned that he would
John.
John of God, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
he would impregnate them. They would have the kids, and then he would like bring them into sex trafficking, or like there seems to be possible like using parts of these children for things like products or whatever. But yeah, he had like a whole business where he would impregnate these women, and sometimes he'd raise the kids, and then I think even sleep with the kids. And that was someone she was promoting. And I don't
right,
understand how these kinds of things can be out. And, Oprah's already is sort of implicated too with the whole Weinstein thing. I think, she's kind of,
right.
she introduces girls to these kinds of networks. And so when, the whole Weinstein thing happened and then the Grammys where Oprah comes out and Reese Witherspoon, who's a victim, you could feel that it would have been possible for the doors to be locked and every man in that room to be, slaughtered because the tension was like so high of like the anger of these women who've been abused in the industry. Although, again, they don't mention the children. Like these women should also be talking about the children, honestly. But again, they're too scared. So that's something. But the fact that Oprah was the one to come onto the stage, I'm like, how stupid are you? Like Reese Witherspoon's holding on to her like her protector. It's like, are you guys really like that stupid that you thought that she's like your protector?
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
think that what people should wonder is whether or not she is an MK Ultra product herself. And it's
I think she was
remembering
abused. She was sexually
she
abused
was
as well
abused.
as a
She
child.
was also intended to be named after Orpah, which is like uh,
What do you see in?
woman in the book of Ruth in the Hebrew Bible. She was from Moab and the daughter of Naomi and wife of Chilion. There's all sorts of very just weird stuff that goes on with her. But yeah, like we could sit here for like half an hour and recount the number of sex abusers. R. Kelly, Sam Altman. Well, I guess Sam Altman's it's a question mark, but I believe the story. But basically, she and Dr. Phil kind of popularized the whole troubled teen industry,
Yeah.
Hmm.
which has now been found to be fraught with all these types of abuses and everything. But what happens is if you've been watching all of this stuff for
Hmm.
the decades that talk show television was very, very popular, and then suddenly you find out that all this stuff was coming, that this was the behind the scenes behavior of the people who you were allowing to become your parasocial spiritual leaders
Hmm.
essentially, then ultimately, how does your brain handle that?
Yeah.
Is it a normalization of governance by aggressive, nonsensical guruism? So long as they're above me, they're allowed. They're allowed to do these abusive things. Is it just governance by, multi-marketing level
Yeah,
type thing?
I actually had someone comment when I was doing my series on Aldous Huxley, and they were, making the point that Aldous Huxley still represents all of these beautiful things. And then when I was able to showcase, he actually wrote a paper on like pro eugenics, pretty much the year of Brave New World, which showcases that Brave New World was not a warning like everyone likes to apologize for him, but was actually the blueprint. And this person responded saying, "So what? It's not like he's running for president." And
What a cop out. What a cop out. Jeez.
that's the kind of disgusting remarks that you hear from a lot of these people who are supposed to be all about, like, spirituality. I'm not saying that everyone who considers themselves a spiritualist, but if you are willing to say that your guru or the person that you look up to as a role model has all of these really extreme problems, like obviously everybody has problems that they have to work on. Not no one's perfect, but when you have extreme problems where you're caught preying on people, or you are promoting a system that is going to, seriously disempower people, that is not something that is excusable for someone that you're supposed to be looking up to. And I don't want to speak too harshly about Oprah in the sense that it's not like someone becomes a monster just like that, but the fact is, Oprah, I don't know how she thinks in her mind. I don't know how these people are kind of turned from like being abused and then being enablers. But even the like very sketch stuff of her buying up real estate, in Hawaii right before that situation happens, I think just kind of showcases how compromised,
Yeah.
she is. Like for me, that's just inexcusable.
So
You're not really someone who's just kind of trapped and scared for your life at that point.
Can I? Yeah, there's something I was thinking about in all of this is that you have whether it's Artie Lang's works on the knots or the double binds of Bateson, but they're all like doing the same thing. Is they're trying to look at schizophrenia as a desirable outcome for patients and for mass societies. They all want to find ways to induce to varying degrees schizophrenia. Um, and they market it like you pointed out to me, Cynthia, in your research. They market it to say, that's how they're able to seduce a lot of dumb student guinea pigs from universities. They were
Oh,
telling them, oh, your IQ will be increased uh,
hmm
by giving yourself over to these experiments, which are designed to make you schizophrenic, to break you, and to
hmm
to do it in a number of ways. But the one thing that I was catching in looking at the underpinnings of Esalen, and earlier you had this thing in Ascona called the Eranos conferences that came out of the whole Ascona anarcho, mystical, theosophical, Freemasonic commune zone of Switzerland. It was the center of the black mass of Central Europe, as they say in the medieval ages, was Ascona. And that's where they had the Eranos conferences that Carl Jung was overseeing. And what they're all fascinated, especially Carl Jung, is the integration of opposites, the coincidentia oppositorum. And he sees this as a core Rosicrucian principle of all initiating processes, that you have to find a way to take moral opposites that fuse into unison. And that's really hard to do because it's friggin' unnatural and you break people along the way. But you need to do it, they say, in order to initiate yourself to be liberated of the shackles of the material world where there's dualisms into this higher. They've got this whole Gnostic cosmology where you basically want to transcend into nothingness, the desired great nothingness of not being that they believe or controls all of the realm of that which is in the ponderable domain, right? That's all created out of nothing and is contained in nothing, and that yearns to go back to nothing. So I think this is like literally the underpinnings of the oligarchy as a death cult. It's a murder suicide cult. And I think what they've been doing in terms of like mass normalizing this through MK Ultra and then the cults and then our society is they're just normalizing something that they were already doing to themselves by default. Which I was thinking about the other thing you were
the
saying about.
Grammys have become the temple for that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's all of these weird temples. There's also, oh yeah, you got like satanic
And
rituals in front of everybody, right? With at the Grammys.
And by the way, I think that the Swedish Prime Minister Olaf Palme, who was assassinated 50 or so years ago, I think 40 years ago, I think this is why he was assassinated, because he took a tour of India and came back telling people around him what is going on there is really dark and it's European politics, right? And of course, the entire creation of independent India was being very controlled by both people who'd been trained by, I mean, Gandhi was trained at the Inner Temple by MI6, and people who were trained by the Theosophical Society. Um, the current party, the Congress Party, was dominating for a few decades, right? And you had, of course, Indira Gandhi throwing the country into a state of emergency when they were losing the election in 1973 for 2 years. So they just had like a straight out dictatorial fascist state, and then returned to normalcy, right? But then you've got the party that rose up more recently, the BJP party. And I never know how to pronounce that, Bharatiya or something, Juanita party. But ultimately, that party still has like two members of the Nehru Gandhi family, back behind it. I think one of whom is being groomed as a future leader. But they're their philosophical underpinning is integralism, and it's that same integralism that weaves through like the discussions of theosophy and Vedanta, and is pulled into like the Stanford Research Institute programs and Institute for Noetic Sciences, and all of these programs that wind up emanating these things we that I think of as now as Neo MK Ultra.
Mhm. And the Fabian Society also played a huge role in the whole Nehru thing. And what were you saying, Matt, that there was something in India that was a sort of city of London setup?
Oh, that was Chennai. That's I think Matthew Crawford actually brought this to my attention.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that was Chennai, which is where Adyar, the headquarters of the Theosophical Society, is located in Chennai. And Chennai is legally as an entity is very similar. It was set up by the British
Mhm.
under the British East India Company. It was set up in a similar way as the City of London was, almost like as an independent corporation. And it's weird. It's weird. And
Right.
I will say
It's the
one thing that
second oldest surviving corporation since the East India Companies are defunct now, right? It was created in like 1688 or 1678 or something. And it was run by Elihu Yale, who then took all the money that he made running that corporation, moved to the United States, and built Yale University, which,
no.
yes.
Wow.
Whoa.
It's one of those ways that you can be certain, even more certain than you already were, that Yale University was the British Empire foot in America,
Wow.
My
right?
God, eh?
Wow.
My God, that's
And
useful. And then it changed the whole idea also of the Skull and Bone Society that the Russell clan set up in 1833, which has as its motto the skull and crossbones of the Templars, because the Templars were a pirate. They also managed the piracy because they had the ports, right, that were in Italy and Spain as part of the ports that would go through the Mediterranean and guide the Crusades. So they had control of the banking and the shipping, and they would utilize these different like piracy cults that they also ran as part of just their proto mafia operation of the seas that then was infused into the Skull and Bones of Yale, that you're saying is directly tied to British India and Chennai.
right,
That's
right.
hilarious. And
Yeah.
also, one thing a friend just sent me another thing too is that Kamala Harris's mother, her family comes from Chennai, as does JD Vance's wife. Her family
Right.
comes from
Well, this was in my article
that was in your article. Oh, that's what
like
I'm
a
hearing.
month
See,
and a half ago. Yeah.
I consume so much information that things end up getting blended into my head.
No,
And
I understand fully. Yeah. Yeah, I'm doing the same thing as well. But yeah, I had noticed that Kamala's parents, sorry, that her grandparents had retired there when I was just looking at a Wikipedia article. I was planning on doing like a 2-page article. This is I'm going to tell this story real quick, and then I'm probably going to need to go eat dinner. But I, so a little over 2 months ago, I was like, wow, we have this presidential candidate that I know hardly anything about, that the world knows hardly anything about. Like whatever you've seen on the news, like whatever, it's like it's not like I could say much about her background or her lineage or whatever. So I thought I was going to do like a 2-page article and just say, isn't it weird that we don't know much about this person? So I started looking some things up because I wanted to talk about it. I thought I'd wind up talking more about like, her legal courtroom stuff, which is interestingly, it's very scarce. It's hard to find. There are a lot of people who suggest that she never actually like was involved in many cases. There's not like much courtroom speech with her name on it, right? But when I noticed, of course, I picked this out immediately, being as interested in the Theosophical Society history as I am. I noticed that her grandparents had retired to the Basant Nagar neighborhood, which is the neighborhood in which the Theosophical International headquarters is located. And so, I mentioned this to James Lindsay on Twitter, and somebody comes in and they're like, oh, blah, 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 there's so many people here. It doesn't mean anything. And I'm like, okay, whatever. So I go a little bit deeper and I find out that Shyamala was born in that neighborhood in 1938. And when the Theosophical Society started building up their headquarters there, this is still when it was called Madras, right? There's no Chennai, there's no Greater Chennai Corporation, which is what it's called now. But it was just this like backwater area with a few buildings, right? I mean, it wasn't like a big bustling city. So 1938. Well, what's going on there? That's when what God, what's her name? I'm running out of brain energy here because I need to eat, but not Alice Bailey, Annie Besant, excuse me. Annie Besant, that's where she was doing a lot of things, right? But she's building up the first family planning program in any developed nation,
Really?
right? For
Wow.
decades, that's the only one in the world in a developing nation. So what is it that Kamala's grandmother was doing? She was involved in traveling around India, encouraging family planning and contraception and teaching contraception.
Wow.
So there's essentially zero chance that Shyamala's mother was not associated with these Theosophical Society people. They lived right around the corner. They're involved in family planning. No, no, that's and now that means that we should be looking more seriously in that. Now we're going to go a step further. More recently, Candace Owens has produced like 10 videos talking about just almost entirely the Petra Kamala's father's family line, which does go back to like British Empire and slavers and all this kind of stuff. And it does appear that she may be. There's a decent bit of evidence that Kamala is sort of like overplaying the race card in terms of like how much of her ancestry is black or something like that. She may have published photos in a book of people that weren't actually her grandmother or great grandmother,
Oh my,
like using blacker people who might have been like the
oh my
family
God.
to make it look like she
No.
was like a well-to-do family. But weirdly, Candace has like people send her my article. She won't say Theosophical Society, and then I start looking into Candace, and I'm like, okay, she's associated with like this Turning Point Media, and who is it that promoted Turning Point Media was John Mappin, the Scientologist who lives in Camelot Castle in England, who
Wow.
was flying the QAnon flag above his castle for 2 years. but
Wow.
but his family has been jeweler to the royal throne for 250 years.
Wow.
Oh,
Fascinating leads, dude. Fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. So
wow.
I'm like, is it like I'm starting to call it the unilarpy. It's not even just a uniparty. It's not even just like I think 90% of the alt media might be sort of compromised or raised up in order to step in front of what we're doing, which is other people just getting involved and talking about um their areas of interest that aren't being discussed in the mainstream media. But it feels to me like is there essentially an agreement, or have the neo-theosophists infiltrated so many quarters with their spins of spins that people won't talk about neo-theosophy and its connection to all the social engineering that's gone on for the past decades and everything. And if we don't talk about it, then we're not talking about, I think, the real true purpose of what MK Ultra fits into, which is this mass patterning, depatterning and repatterning, and pressuring people to the point of schizophrenia within like these large group awareness training programs. So I think
Yeah.
I hope that people will take that away from this conversation. And I can't say how grateful I am to the two of you, your research and talking with you, because all of these things that I brought to today's conversation, like ultimately, like when I bounced off you guys for the first time last year, you opened up so many more of these avenues then that made sense in terms of everything that I knew that I had seen growing up in my childhood, but that wind up, putting together a coherent picture of history as some sort of a network,
Mm-hmm.
creating this planning for this moment. And in order for people to understand how to resist empire, how to resist authoritarianism, how to resist evil, that has to be understood. So,
Amen, brother.
Yeah, I learned so much just from this short session with you, Matthew Crawford. So, yeah, we're also super grateful. We should definitely do these discussion sessions more often, just sharing, comparing notes and that sort of thing. I know that for me, speaking to Matt, my husband, sorry, having two Matts in the group, um, that that really helps with the like mapping out and adding more structure to understanding. So we should definitely, do these kinds of discussions more often. It's super beneficial.
yeah, reach out to me anytime.
Well, definitely,
Terrific.
wholes are more than the sum of their parts. And I think, yeah, we've all come in as three parts of a whole here, and we've come out with a lot more than we came in with. So this is really great. I found it edifying. I hope people watching also found it edifying. Please go and subscribe to Matthew Crawford's Rounding the Earth if you haven't done that yet on Substack. It's in the description box under this video. Also, Cynthia and myself have our own Substacks. You can get those links in the description boxes. So, yeah, we're looking forward to the future chats that we're going to definitely have in the days and weeks ahead. So, thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you. Have a good night, guys.
Bye.
Good night.